What is blood sugar? We often use the words or the term blood sugar, but what does that really mean and where does this sugar come from? Blood sugar, the official term for blood sugar is blood glucose. So the sugar in our blood is called glucose. Now, our body needs a certain amount of glucose in our blood at all times. This is because certain cells of the body need access to glucose and need to be delivered glucose to be used as energy and be able to function and us to survive. However, we only need a very small amount of this sugar called glucose in our blood. In all of our 5 litres or 8 pints of blood in the adult body, we only want 1 teaspoon, just 1 teaspoon or 5 grams of glucose in all of our blood. So 5 litres of blood, just 1 teaspoon of glucose. This is obviously a very small amount and it is very important for our body to keep it under control. We need a bit, but we don't want much. Now, where does this glucose come from? So we need glucose in our blood every minute of the day to survive. So we need to be able to get glucose into our blood. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from 2 places. First of all, it comes from our food. It will come from sugar in our food, and it will also come from starch, or starchy carbohydrate, as some people know it. Let's first think about sugar. So there are various types of sugar, but one of the common sugars that we eat that has glucose in it is table sugar, also known as sucrose. Part of table sugar, half of table sugar is glucose. So if we eat table sugar, then we're in effect eating glucose, and that will pass from our gut into our blood. The other types of sugar are the man-made sugar, so high fructose corn syrup, which is in many of our processed manufactured foods, is full of glucose. And also sugar that comes part of naturally occurring foods such as fruit. So that's one place glucose can come from in our food. The other, as I mentioned, is starchy carbohydrate. Now, what is starchy carbohydrate? So as far as foods go, starchy carbohydrate refers to bread, floury products, pasta, rice, also breakfast cereals is a common source of starchy carbohydrate for lots of people. Potatoes and tubers, or these parts of plants that grow deep underground, ready for growing a new plant, are full of starch. Now, as you may start to realise, starch is something that comes from plants, and in effect you can see it as the plant's sugar store. So plants make glucose from sunlight and water and carbon dioxide, it's a thing called photosynthesis, and they bring all that together and they make glucose. The plant then sticks these glucose molecules together into long chains, and that's what starch is. Now, when we eat starchy carbohydrates, for example, when we eat a piece of bread or a potato or some rice or pasta, then that starch goes into our mouth and immediately we start to digest that starch. We start to break that starch back down into single glucose, single sugar molecules, and then these can then pass into our blood and raise our blood sugar level. So that's where sugar comes from. That's where glucose comes from in our food, from sugar that we eat and from starchy carbohydrates. However, there is somewhere else that glucose in our blood comes from. And this happens to every single one of us, every single moment of our life. And fortunately it does, otherwise we wouldn't get through a day without eating continuously. This other place that glucose can come from is our liver. So our liver being a big organ that sits at the top right of our tummy. Our liver makes glucose. So our liver, this incredible chemical processing unit, can take other things such as components of the fat from our body and also bits of protein called amino acids, and it can turn that into glucose. So our liver is constantly doing this if it needs to make glucose and release it into the blood. Now, it's just as well the body could do this, because if we need to have a small amount of glucose in our blood at all times, and for some reason we couldn't eat for a day, then if our liver wasn't making glucose, we would in effect die, which clearly doesn't happen to us every day. So the fact our liver can do this is essential for our survival. The liver can also store glucose, so it's quite a good storage site. So if we eat too much glucose, or we eat a lot of glucose, or the liver's been making it for a while and we haven't needed it, it will pack that together in the liver in something called glycogen, which is like the body's starch, and store it, and then it can break that back down and release it into the blood. So I'm going to summarize all this now. So first of all, the sugar in the blood is called glucose. We only want a small amount of glucose in our blood at any one time, just 1 teaspoon in all of our 8 pints or 5 litres of blood. The glucose in our blood can come from the food we eat, sugars and starchy carbohydrates, and it can also come from our liver. Our liver can store glucose as something called glycogen, and it can also make glucose and release that into the blood.